Ukrainian and Russian officials met at the Belarus border for some 5 hours, but could only agree to continue their discussions. And that has dashed hopes of a ceasefire to end days of hostilities since Russia invaded Ukraine last week. On the ground, the Russian advance appears to have slowed, but the U.S. says Russian troops intend to surround and capture the capital, Kyiv, within days. Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, saw some of the heaviest shelling yet since the invasion began. And Russian rockets pounded the city, killing at least 9 civilians and wounding scores more. Kharkiv, though, remains in Ukrainian control despite Russian forces laying siege. And latest satellite images from Maxar show a massive Russian convoy headed towards the capital. And it says the convoy is 64 kilometers long and comprises of armored vehicles, including tanks, towed artillery, and other logistical vehicles. Now, for more insight on Russia's advance into Ukraine, we're joined by Allan Behm. He's the director of the International Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Allan. Well, there's been stiffer than expected Ukrainian resistance. The President Zelensky himself appears to be skeptical about the chances for peace. Are we in for the worst yet in this battle by the Russians to take Ukraine?
I'm afraid so, Ellen. I think that it is headed for a very serious period of conflict. It seems to me very unlikely that President Putin is simply going to accept a status quo, or even less likely that he would withdraw behind a line of control, for example. I think that having committed his forces in the way in which he has, there is little likelihood that he will desist. Much more probable, I think, is that Russia will push its forces further towards Kiev with the view of overtaking the Ukraine completely.
Now, Russia appears to be ramping up its campaign in the east and south. Perhaps help us understand why this is important to their campaign on the ground.
Right. Well, it is ramping up its campaign to the east. That is the attack on Kharkov, really. And because that is where Russia's main forces are. They are directly to the east of the Ukraine. There are some forces to the north in Belarus, and there are some forces to the south. But most of Russia's forces are in Russia, and they will come from the east. And I think the resistance of the Ukrainian people has taken the Russian forces something by surprise. And so they realise that the force availability from, say, 150,000 people at the beginning of this campaign is not nearly enough to be able to subdue the Ukrainian people and to conquer Ukraine itself.
Well, then it is appearing that devastation that Russia is trying to inflict on Ukraine is really large. We are hearing of the use of even vacuum bombs. Perhaps you can tell us more about these vacuum bombs and their strategy on this.
Well, I think the last place you would ever want to be is in the path of one of these vacuum bombs. They're actually called hyperbaric bombs. They're a flame munition, essentially, consisting of 2 parts. One of them is a small bomb, which then sprays what is essentially petroleum gas into a large area, a large volume, and then a second bomb that explodes the petroleum gas, creating an enormous shockwave, enormous explosion, and it sucks the oxygen out of the air, thereby asphyxiating everybody who's there. It is a terrible weapon, but particularly, I think, a shocking weapon to use against civilian populations. It is the sort of weapon, I think, that the international community would like to see banned because of its uncontrollable consequences against civilians.
Do you think this is just a beginning? Because just a couple of days ago, or rather even till yesterday, President Putin had put the nuclear weapons on high alert. So is this a beginning and to more to come?
Well, I think the decision to put his nuclear readiness status at a higher level was essentially a warning to everybody. Don't mess with me, is what he's saying. That impacts directly on Ukraine itself because it really can't call upon Western forces to intervene in its defence, because for the Western countries to do so, President Putin would be saying, OK, you've upped the ante, and so you have given me a tacit agreement that I could consider using a tactical nuclear weapon against you. Probably not in their home stage, but the use of any form of nuclear weapon, tactical or otherwise, in the Ukraine itself would be a totally disastrous development, both locally and, of course, internationally. To use an overused word, it would, in modern times, be totally unprecedented.
Well, there are also other worries about further salvos from the skies. Ukraine practically begging Western allies to impose a no-fly zone over significant parts of the country. Why is there so much foot dragging on this?
Well, I think it is essentially that the Western countries, NATO members and the United States, don't want to have their forces in a head-on engagement with the forces of Russia. Because Putin would certainly say that that is an act of aggression against Russia, and that would, I think, give him a green light to resort to even further weapons systems, perhaps even including nuclear weapons, in defence of Russia and of its interests that is currently developing in Ukraine itself. Look, we are in an extraordinarily dangerous situation, and at this point the Western powers are very careful not to inflame the situation any further. They've imposed very, very significant sanctions, and quite evidently those sanctions, economic sanctions, are not sufficient to deter President Putin from the course of action that he's chosen. So to go any further, but particularly to invoke the use of armed responses, would create a level of danger that I don't think the West is yet prepared to accept. And I don't think the global community at large is yet prepared to accept the consequences of such a move. So I think the world is holding its breath and watching, but the stakes are very, very high at this moment.
Now, very quickly, our last question. It's been said that the tough global sanctions on Russia have essentially vaporized its assets. Could this fuel vengeance in the battle to seize Ukraine then?
Whether it fuels vengeance or not, I'm not sure. But what it does do, I think, is stiffen Putin's resolve. I don't think that the sanctions are going to stop him from doing what he wants to do, which is not only to provide Russia with some further territorial protection, some buffer state to its west. It is also designed for Putin to reclaim what he says is historic Russian lands. That, of course, is highly debated by the Ukrainians, but that's what he said in his very, very long speech last week. So I think in all of this, we are seeing a game being played where the deterrent effect of economic sanctions is not working, and the West is not prepared to use armed force as a deterrent, and Russia's huge asset base. It's got $800 billion in reserves and other assets. They may not be liquid at the moment, but they're certainly there. And it will prompt Russia to look for ways around the closure of the SWIFT system and new ways of being able to capitalise on its resource base. So we're in very, very dangerous territory in very, very dangerous times.
Thank you very much for the elaborate insights. That was Allan Behm, Director of the International and Security Affairs Programme at the Australia Institute.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.